It's Reality Check with Craig Price.
I'm an idiot.
4 minutes in and I'm already wrong.
I'm like a monkey. Hello, look at me.
You're like a beautiful mind. I'm more like Forrest Gump.
So it's,
Craig Price is the man.
I knew it. Craig, shut up. It's Reality Check with Craig Price. I'm your host, Craig Price, and this week, Lou Sapienza joins me to talk about MIA retrieval. Hope you're having a good day. Thanks for downloading the podcast. I always appreciate it. But before we get to this week's guest, a quick reminder. You can download the podcast app, and you can find links at realitycheckpodcast.com and get access to episode extras like entire books, articles, teleseminars, and more that many of the guests donate to the app so you can learn more after each episode. We get so many good folks on talking about so many different things that there's plenty of goodies to get. It's free, it's available on all platforms, and you can download today at realitycheckpodcast.com. Well, this week's guest has an interesting story and mission, and I don't normally have people on to tell stories per se. They usually come on and talk about broader topics with some stories thrown in, but this week is different because what Lou is doing, I feel, is important. It's important because it helps fulfill our contract with those that serve. If you are lost or killed during duty, it is our obligation as a nation to retrieve those bodies for the families so they can have some closure. I mean, they gave their lives to protect us and protect our way of life. The least we can do is bring them home. Thankfully, there are guys like Lou who do this. Lou Sapienza is with North-South Polar Incorporated, and they go to places most people can't, like Antarctica and Greenland, bring in the proper equipment and help our military retrieve people who are missing in action. But like anything run by the government, there are limitations, and most of those limitations are financial. So I want you to listen to what Lou's talking about today, and if his story moves you to action, please contact your local representative or senator and let them know that funding operations like this is important to you. So let's learn exactly how Lou conducts these MIA retrievals with this week's guest, Lou Sapienza. So you were referred to me by a friend, a mutual friend of ours, and what you do sounds so interesting and amazing. Can you explain a little bit of what North-South Polar does and for who?
North-South Polar was actually founded at the request of the U.S. Military Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, otherwise known as JPAC, out in Honolulu. They are the division of the Department of Defense charged with recovering our 83,000 MIAs missing in action from World War II forward. Through all of that, there are only 32,000 men and women that are deemed to be recoverable. So many went down in deep sea losses with the Navy, etc., that the number is somewhere around 32,000. We still have about 1,650 from Southeast Asia, Vietnam era. From what I understand, about 17,000 and some from Korea, and the rest are all from World War II. And NSP, I got a call from JPAC back in 2010 and asked if we would help in the recovery of 3 men that went down in a Grumman J2F4 Grumman Duck. It's an amphibious biplane that went down in November of 1942 in a very remote section of Greenland. And they called me because I've consulted with them in the past on 3 men that are buried under the wing of their aircraft down in Antarctica. And I'd also made a presentation to JPAC on that. But what gave us our skill sets in order to do this is I was part of a team in 1989, 90, and 92 that recovered a World War II P-38, now known as Glacier Girl. It's a twin boomed fuselage type aircraft, and that was recovered from 268 feet below the surface, only 30 miles from the site where we're working to recover the 3 men from the Grumman Duck. The Lost Squadron, which was the P-38, there were 6 P-38s and 2 B-17s as part of Operation Bolero. It was a ferry mission where they decided to start ferrying aircraft from the United States to England for the war effort. There were so many planes that were on ships, on victory ships, and they were being sunk by U-boats, so they came up with something called Operation Bolero to start shuttling the aircraft over some very remote regions and at a time when there wasn't any communication from one air station to the next. They'd usually have to get to their halfway point before they would get the information as to whether they were allowed to land because of weather. But going back, NSP, I was called in 2010 to aid in the recovery of these 3 men on the J2F Fort Grumman Duck, Lieutenant John Pritchard, Radioman First Class Benjamin Bottoms, and Corporal Lauren Howarth. And at that point, I was just an individual, but because we're dealing with the government and that type of thing, I had to form a company, and that company is North-South Polar, and we had to, meet all the qualifications and requirements of doing business with the federal government.
And my guest today is Lou Sapienza. You are the CEO of North-South Polar, and when you do these missions, obviously it sounds like the DoD kind of assigns you or ask you, look, we've got a situation where we want you to go to Greenland. So can you kind of walk me through how you know where to even start looking?
Well, in this instance with Greenland, they knew that the plane had gone down in a certain area. And so they came and just asked for our help because we had recovered this aircraft from 268 feet down inside the glacier, and because I had made presentations to JPAC in the past, and there isn't any other organization that has the skill sets to do that, they came to us. So we had a good idea of where the aircraft was to begin with. However, they really hadn't been extremely thorough in their research. There had been aircraft flying aerial-borne ground-penetrating radar through the area at the request of the U.S. Coast Guard to try to find the aircraft below the ice. And the aircraft run certain types of radar that's generally used for mapping bedrock below glaciers and ice sheets and that type of thing. And if you find an anomaly between the top of the ice sheet and the bedrock, that indicates that you might have an aircraft there. So there was a P-3 Orion coming back from Afghanistan that went through, and basically in Afghanistan they were looking for minerals to help with the economy there. They came back and pinged the site, and they had really never done this before, and they came up with 6 different spots as possible locations. There was also another aircraft that went through and found a 10-meter highly reflective target, which is about the right size for the fuselage. So we had that information, but we went up in 2010 to look for this aircraft, and basically they wanted us to go up and just excavate. And I said, hold your horses on this, guys. What you really want to do before we start and before we bring in heavy equipment and all the excavation equipment into such a remote, dangerous, and hostile area, we really need incontrovertible photographic proof that we know the depth of the aircraft, we know exactly the location and its attitude within the ice sheet so that we can be totally prepared and so that there are no surprises. JPAC and the Coast Guard agreed with that. We went up in 2010 and looked at their primary site that they thought they could actually see the wheel of an aircraft from the P-3 Orion that had flown over. And aerial-borne ground-penetrating radar is not that accurate. You would never see anything like that. So we went up in 2010. In 2009, there had been a very small team with a very limited amount of boots on the ground ground-penetrating radar, went over the spot, found the anomaly that the P-3 had found, and said, yeah, it's there, hire us, and we'll excavate it and bring it out. Well, that's when we came in and said we needed the incontrovertible proof. So we went up late in the season in August of 2010. We found the site that the P3 had seen, that the previous ground-penetrating radar people had seen, but we had an extra element that we bored down into the ice sheet and actually lower cameras down so that we can see what's down below us. And if we don't hit it on the first try, then we put out a survey grid and move the camera at about 18-inch increments until we hit or find it. And when we went up, we found nothing. All that we could do was confirm, basically not confirm that it was there. There was no evidence that the aircraft was in that spot. And at that point, we had to bug out. We actually got stuck out on the ice sheet for an additional 6 days because of weather. We have to fly visual flight rules out there, and our helicopter contract, the helicopters are actually based 120 miles away, and they would have to come in to pick us up. And weather was such that for 6 days they could not get off the ground. Either the weather was bad there or it was bad at site. So we actually had to leave at that point.
Well, what kind of equipment are you hauling in there at this particular point? I mean, obviously you've got some kind of drilling equipment to bore into the ground, and you've got some sort of cameras. But I mean, when you think about going in the Arctic, even if you're just being dropped off by helicopter, it's not just a backpack and a couple pair of shoes.
It's a little bit more than that, but not a whole heck of a lot more than that. I had been up there in 1989, 90, and 92, that was just at a site 30 miles away, and the area actually is known to be much like Thurston Island down in Antarctica. You can get winds that are sustained for 36 hours, and they'll be blowing 70 to 80, 90 knots with driven snow, and you have to know how to camp. We're camping in tents. We have some mountain hardware domes and that type of thing, but you have to know how to dig in or shelter yourself and that type of thing. So we go up there with foods, with expedition stoves, small stuff. Again, we were only supposed to be there for 5 or 6 days. So we go in fairly light. The helicopter flights are extremely expensive, and we have a limited amount of flights and that type of thing. So we're actually camping in 4 season tents. We have a big common dome that we use. It's called a satellite station for Mountain Hardware. And that was fine, for the 5 or 6 days that we were up there. And as far as the technical equipment that we bring up, we bring ground-penetrating radar that's configured for ice because most ground-penetrating radar is used in Earth.
Well, that ground-penetrating radar, I've seen that here where I live, where they were just trying to find pipes and cement because there was leaks in the foundation. How big a unit is that? Because the one that they used, it looked like, I guess you would say, an industrial floor cleaner. It was fairly large. It's not like it's not like the radar you'd see on the beach.
Yeah, that's a metal detector, this type of thing that you see on the beach. Yeah. And basically the type of equipment that you want to have is 2-part, and it's generally 2 sleds. And the first sled is the transponder, and the second sled is a receiver. And you'll ping down, and the receiver will take that information. And basically what you're looking for are certain disruptions within the ice, same type of disruptions that you look for in Earth, except you've got a much better conductor when you have ice. One of our problems that we run into on the glacier is that later in the season, you've got a lot of water that's actually running through the ice. In some instances, you've got 70 meters from the surface of the ice and to the point where it's solid ice, and everything within that 70 feet strata is actually porous. So you've got melt, and it's melting through and percolating down and running along the top of where the ice is solidly formed. And when you start to have that much water within the ice sheet or within the glacier, it can mix up the signals quite a bit, and sometimes you don't know what you're looking at, and your readings aren't as accurate as they should be. So it's actually important to go in very early in the season before you have much melt going on. And that season in Greenland's case is May, and in May the weather is still fairly snotty. You can get snow, you can get 6 feet of snow almost overnight. I mean, your tents will be completely buried. You unzip your tent, and it's just a wall of snow. You have to kind of push it out and make a tunnel and go upwards. So it gets a little crazy, but that's when the equipment works at its best. So that's generally when we want to go in and do this. So we use one ground-penetrating radar. We'll use a magnetometer that will look for magnetic variances no matter how slight. Basically, we're working with aluminum aircraft that doesn't have much of a metallic or at least an iron-based, it's not iron-based, which is what the magnetometer really works off of. And then we will also use some other proprietary equipment. There's a new piece out that we'll be using, and that's electromagnetic pulse imaging, which is somewhat related to ground penetrating radar, but not really. And when most people think of magnetic pulses, they think of hydrogen bombs and things that disrupt computers and just kind of wipe out a whole bunch of electronics and that type of thing. And it's not nuclear based at all. It's more like ground penetrating radar, but with some additional features that allows us to see up to 15 meters below the surface, and will also almost give us a 3D image of the item that we're looking for once we find it. This same equipment was used to find an aircraft engine after the Battle of Britain that was in an intersection in Britain. I think it was found about 10 years ago, but it pretty much clearly showed that, it was rectangular and metal and likely an aircraft engine kind of thing.
Well, how big is the crew that you bring along? Because it sounds like there's quite a bit of equipment. Like I said, those ground penetrating radars are sleds. They're not small. So what's the normal size for a crew out there?
Well, the ground penetrating radar sleds are fairly small and compact. One person, a geophysicist who is familiar with the units and the readings, can operate it. We generally have a second person that helps them out, because once you gather that data, it all has to go back and be processed on the computer. But generally our team is comprised of what I call 3 mountaineers. They're usually EMTs. One is a captain in the U.S. Army Reserve who is a medical officer, and one of the other persons is also an EMT. But they're mountaineers. They know how to rope everybody together and be safe. And we do have some major crevasses in the area, but generally where we've been working, those crevasse fields are relatively far away by our standards. So we have those 3. There's myself, and we've got a cook. So generally it's 8 to 10 to 12 people, depending upon what types of things we need to do once we're out there. If you go with too small of a team, you're not really safe because you're not able to dig out, so to speak, once a major storm hits. You don't want to be there with just 3 or 4 people. Generally, my teams are at least 8 to 10. In some instances where we're doing the actual excavations themselves, those will go up to about 15 people.
And then you've got, I want to say, 3 to 4 helicopters that drop you off, or is like teams in 4, or are they big Hueys that drop off the whole team at once?
We usually use Air Greenland as our charter helicopter company. They've got A-Star 350 3Bs. They can fit 4 passengers and some gear. So we get all the people out. Our first helicopter flight is people in survival gear, so that we get to the location and we set up some tents, and we usually set up the main common dome tent, and people will be coming at that helicopter will go back, and other people will be shuttling in. Generally, when we infiltrate the area, we've got 2 helicopters flying back and forth from our base station, which is about 120 kilometers away, basically 100 miles away.
So it does take a little bit of coordination. It's not just a quick little jaunt.
No, it's not a quick little jaunt. In fact, sometimes the military, back in 2009, before they started using us, they really didn't want to stay out on the glacier, so they would do day trips, and it would kind of be jaunty, but you don't get a lot of work done that way. And my previous experiences with Greenland and knowing how to survive the area, you're going to get the maximum amount of work done if you're out there, you're set, and you weather through the storms. Otherwise, you might get stuck back at the base station at the hotel kind of thing, and we're out there to get a job done. We're out there to find and recover these men. But the logistics can get more complicated than that. Last time we went out in 2013, we had a 300-foot Russian cargo ship that was 18 miles out at sea, 21 miles from base camp, and couldn't get any closer due to all the icebergs and such. And I've had 2 helicopters running back and forth to the ship, unloading about 35,000 pounds of equipment in what's known as a sling load, where you've got a sling below the helicopter and it picks stuff up in a cargo net and brings it on in. And then we also have another ship that can get closer that lays a fuel depot and that type of thing. So it can get quite complicated.
Well, so the first time you went out there, 2010, you poked around a little bit, you drilled some holes where they thought they might be the plane, and it wasn't there.
Correct.
So what happens next? Do you have to wait an entire year to come back?
In that instance, yes, because it was so late in the season, there isn't really any time to do any more, and there are budgets involved, and so you run out of time. You run out of time because you don't have the budget to pay for any more than that. You're also at the end of the season, the weather's coming in, it's getting snotty, and you don't want to be out there really into mid to late September because it's just not pleasant, and people die under those circumstances. So we didn't go back, and I was extremely frustrated at this, but we had more experience in this than the Coast Guard at that point, with whom we were working with. And I kind of get blinders on, and I said, if these guys are here, we can find them. We know that. But they didn't give me all the information. They gave me their primary site, and we confirmed that nothing was there. And also, once you get out to the ice, you could see it. An aircraft to get in this particular position, it would have to be the weirdest crash that ever happened. It just didn't make any sense where it would have gone down. So what we did is I worked with a NASA JPL scientist, Dr. Alberto Bahar, who just recently passed away in an aircraft crash a few weeks ago. But Dr. Bahar had developed for us our cameras to go down inside the glacier and to look. And I also asked him if he could develop a glacier tracking device. Basically, it's a small Pelican case with an Iridium phone and a GPS in it. And every 12 hours, it would broadcast to a satellite that reported to a website, and it would report its position. And in that way, we would know the velocity, how fast the glacier was moving, and in what direction the glacier was moving, if in fact it was moving at all. So I left 2 of these. We planted 2 of these at 2 other suspected sites that I was able to glean from Coast Guard at that point, and then we left. And at that point, being somewhat frustrated, I said, I need all the information if we're going to find this aircraft and we're going to recover the men. So I went about for the next 18 months, 2 years, collecting all the available information. where the plane had actually flown out. And this is all documented in the New York Times best-selling book by Mitchell Zuckoff entitled Frozen in Time. I think it was the number 17 Amazon nonfiction book back then. But all this information is pretty much there. So I started gathering information, flight logs, logs from the ship, etc. This plane had actually gone out. It was the first ever amphibious aircraft to go out and land on an ice sheet, basically using its pontoons. And they were rescuing crewmen from a B-17 that had gone down looking for a C-53 transport plane that had gone down a few weeks earlier.
So this was a rescue of a rescue of a rescue.
Exactly. So we have 3 aircraft down on this rescue. The men from the C-53, and this is another plane that we want to find, but there were 5 men on that. We knew it crashed. There was voice communications with them. They saw flares, so we know we have a heading of where the C-53 would be, but they were never able to get to them, so they either froze to death or starved to death out there. And so we're going to be looking for them at some point as well. But back to what they call the duck hunt, because this is a J2F for Grumman duck. I started collecting all this information. We know where the plane had landed. We have the radio logs from the time it took off to the time communications ceased. We knew the direction that the aircraft was going in, and we knew the approximate speed that it was flying. So we could extrapolate a radius as to where that aircraft would be. And we combined that, and this was the first time I started doing overlays on Google Earth. I took all the ground-penetrating radar information from the P-3 Orion, from the Twin Otter. There had been 3 or 4 overflights. So we started plotting all this, and there were historical sightings of the aircraft as well. So I began plotting all this stuff together and see if anything overlaid on top of another one. And we had some things that were fairly close. And from all that information, and after going over it for almost 2 years, I came up with a plan to use ground-penetrating radar, magnetometer, etc., on these particular points in a general area surrounding them. And in 2012, when we went up, we actually came up and started getting some pings off the radar. Unfortunately, again, we were short on time. I had asked for 20 days to be out on the ice. We got 6. The aircraft were already on their way in to pick us up when we started seeing bits and pieces within the ice sheet at the proper depth of evidence of aircraft parts. And we were seeing these not directly down with the camera, but we were seeing them off to the side in the ice. So we just took that information and we had to leave. And then there was a subsequent expedition in 2013 that kind of came up fruitless insofar as that we were hired to be experts in this and to find and recover these men, but the military came on board and they micromanaged everything and would only allow us to look within a 150 by 150 square box.
So wait a minute, you're trying to tell me that the government came in and things got worse?
That happens, doesn't it?
I can't believe that. That sounds so unbelievable. It is inconsistent with my knowledge of the U.S. government.
Well, to be fair, there are certain people within these government organizations that knew why we were hired and fully expected us to be able to do our job. However, that never got down to the operational people, and that's where the difficulties started to come in. So we came up with a huge wash in 2013. I felt extremely confident that if we had been allowed to do our job, that we would have found the aircraft. I think it's a couple of 100 feet to maybe half a mile away, but I had extrapolated a lot of data and discovered some other overlays and flight lines that were parallel, and these things wouldn't be parallel unless it was along a given line. So if we had been allowed to do our job in 2013, I'm extremely confident that we would have found the aircraft. And in 2014, our organization was completely cut out by the operational people, and all they wanted to do was poke holes in the ice and look down with the camera and expect to find it, which is really, when you're putting the camera down, you're supposed to be verifying what the ground penetrating radar or the electromagnetic pulse imaging found. That's how you verify it. You don't use the camera just to poke holes down and look, and hopefully, we're seeing airplane parts, but that's like looking for a needle in a haystack with a needle.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen, or you're going to get extremely lucky.
So are you planning on going back there at any time? Is that something that's currently scheduled, or is it still up in the air?
It's still up in the air. JPAC has undergone a restructuring, and that just actually happened about 2 weeks ago, which was sometime in January of 2015. The people that I've been working with at the higher echelons within JPAC are aware of what should have happened and are trying to schedule an appointment with the top people within JPAC so that I can try to get this mission back online. I mean, if I had unlimited resources or could get funding elsewhere, we would go up and kind of do our thing. I mean, I've become very personally involved. This is a passion of mine, and I generally get to know the families. The pilot, Lieutenant John Pritchard, his sister is still alive. She's about 92 years old, and I converse with her on a regular basis. And, we do this for the families. We have a national policy that's kind of unofficial of leave no man behind, basically sums up what is in Title 10 of U.S. Code. I think it's Section 1864, something along those numbers. But we are supposed to bring back all of our missing in action and POWs. It's mandated by law. So I just feel a personal obligation that since we have these special skill sets to be able to find these men, that I have a personal obligation to do it because nobody else is.
Do you just specialize mostly in because I know you do the Antarctic as well. Are you cold weather specialist, or are you got a wider range of experts that you can pull from for underwater or in the jungle or somewhere?
We can kind of do it all. I mean, it's really my brand of leadership in the company is you pull together the best people that you can in given areas, and I'm a pretty good judge of character pretty much, and I just pull together the right people so that we can go anywhere to do anything. I mean, I get a call from the Philippines. There's two B-24s sitting on a mountaintop in a remote area that some hikers had found, and there's bones in the cockpit. There's dog tags, blah blah blah, and so we're trying to get out there. Right now, JPAC is only recovering 80 to 125 people per year. Congress mandated starting this year that number go up to, I believe, 200 a year. So that's why they had the restructuring. And, here it is in the Philippines. We can get probably 22 men just at these two sites that are relatively easy to get to and recover. So we are cold weather specialists. We're trying to do this mission down in Antarctica, which kind of started this whole thing where there were relatives of these men, there were sisters and nephews that wanted these men to come home. The Navy had promised for 60 years that they would bring these three men home from Antarctica. And Navy had spent a lot of money on doing all the developmental research work in order to bring the men home. But instead of Navy handing the case over to JPAC to do, Navy said that they wanted to do it themselves. And after 3 years of going through whatever it is that they go through, they decided that it was too dangerous. They really didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have any idea of how much it would cost or what the logistics would be, et cetera, et cetera. So Navy said at that point it's too dangerous. The families came to me. I said, this is the kind of stuff that we've done. We've done it. We've put, holes down to 268 feet, and there was actually a radar overflight in 2004 that pinged the site, found it. It's a huge plane. It's a 118-foot wingspan, and basically found it. And I said, this is something that we could do. There was an article in Air and Space magazine entitled Buried at the Bottom of the World back around 2008, which I had read, which prompted me to call the families and said, I don't know what the problem is because it's not really rocket science. We have the skill sets to do this. So at that point, the families asked me to do a proposal to Navy, which I put together, sent in, and they decided it was still too unsafe. I continued on with this because it's not unsafe. We actually and they also said it's too remote, it's too distant, it's 1,600 miles from McMurdo. And I said, well, yeah, it's 1,600 miles from McMurdo, but we have a weather station there. The Pine Island Glacier, which is 236 miles away, is the most studied area in all of Antarctica because it's home of the Pine Island Glacier. It's the fastest moving glacier in the world, and there's between 5 and 7 different countries that have camps there during the summer that basically study that glacier. So there's plenty of people in the area. 236 miles away doesn't sound close, but in Antarctica, it's close. Plus, back in the 1990s, the Navy was actually flying scientists onto the Ross Ice Shelf and then actually shuttling them up onto this island called Thurston Island to do studies up there. So it's not like we haven't been there before. So we tried to bring all the information out into the open and make our arguments. The families eventually set up a meeting between one of the family members, myself, and the chief of naval personnel, a vice admiral down in Virginia, and he said, your plan sounds pretty good. Why don't you go out to JPAC and give them a presentation on this, which then I scheduled, went out and met with Rear Admiral Donna Crisp and 10 of her senior staff, gave the presentation. The upshot is you take a high-risk mission and make it medium risk. We do medium risk all the time. We believe so much in this mission, we'll underwrite the first $200,000 of the mission, and because this is a non-hostile loss, Navy would be responsible for the rest of it. Navy then turned around after years of saying, we're going to do it. No, it's too unsafe. We don't know what we're doing now. They turn around and said, oops, we made a mistake. Back in 1947, those men were rendered proper burial honors, so that's where we want them to remain. And if you try to recover the men, we would consider it a desecration of their graves, which set off a whole bunch of alarms because if the families want the men back, they are entitled to go out and to do that. If they want to hire somebody to go out and do it, they're perfectly entitled to do it. So we were looking for ways to raise the money in order to go down and to do that mission. And we're still going back and forth. I helped one of our congressmen write legislation. It's called a Sense of Congress that passed the U.S. House of Representatives 3 times, and it keeps getting nixed by Senator John McCain in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And so it has never been confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So now I'm trying to work with some senators so that once we get it through the House, the Senate will do it, and it will basically override Navy's refusal to do it.
Well, what can the average listener who's listening to this right now, what can they do right now to help you get these projects going and on track?
It's a good question, but it's also somewhat a difficult question to answer, because in many ways it's just a question of money. It seems as though all the petitioning of Congress in the world doesn't seem to do too much. We have the skill sets. We know how to do this stuff. In fact, JPAC twice offered to Navy to undertake the mission, but Navy says no. And the only thing that we can do is highlight this stuff in the press and see if there's some outrage about it. I've always said that if the President of the United States knew that Navy was refusing to bring home these 3 men, I don't think the President, regardless of who's in office, would stand for these kind of shenanigans. It's not a difficult mission to do, but you do have to know what you're doing. And it's no more different. The Antarctic mission is no more different than what we were doing in Greenland, recovering 3 men that are 40 feet down inside the glacier. The difference is this is in Antarctica, and the men are 90 to 150 feet down inside the glacier. The big difference is that in Greenland, we know that ice sheet is not moving because we're actually on the side of a mountain. The mountain actually sticks up through the ice where we are. It's called a Nunatak. And so this thing is just kind of plastered on the side and not moving. But if you go a half a mile around the outside of that, there is glacier movement, and it's moving pretty quick. Jump now back to Antarctica, and this ice sheet, this glacier, is moving, and it's moving at a fairly good rate. And that area where the men are buried under the wing is going to calve off into the Bellingshausen Sea. And one of the survivors just recently passed away earlier this year, and he said, I don't want my buddies to become shark bait. And this man, who was 18 years old at the time and who died, I guess he was 90-some-odd years old, who just passed away, he made a lifetime of petitioning people like Senator John McCain in Congress and all these other people to do this. What's kind of curious about this is Senator John McCain was the person who fast-tracked the Antarctic mission back in the 1990s at the request of Robbie Robbins, who was one of the survivors. But now it's Senator John McCain who is nixing and not allowing the mission to go forward. And we're not able to get a straight answer from anywhere.
Where can people learn more about you and North-South Polar? Because I think this is something that people need to know about, number one, and something that need to spread around. I think it's just lack of education. It's just people don't know what you're doing. They just don't know that what you're doing even exists. So how can they learn more about you and help you spread your message?
There's a website. It's www.nspolar.us. That's www. November Sierra Papa Oscar Lima Alpha Radar .Uniform Sierra. That is our company website. There's also an affiliated nonprofit 501(c) called the Fallen American Veterans Foundation that was founded by family members of the George I. And that website is www.FAVF.us. It's the acronym, the first letter of each Fallen American Veterans Foundation.us.
That's the show. Thanks again to Lou and his crew at North-South Polar for all they do for our fallen troops. You can find the show on Twitter at RealityCheckPod. We have a Facebook page you can like and listen to the podcast in feed. Email Craig at speakercraigprice.com with comments, questions, or guest suggestions, which is how we got today's guest. We'll see you next week.